Welcome to this tutorial where I am going to show you how to build an image gallery using Gatsby and Oracle Content Headless CMS. My name is Peter Grundy. I am a developer working on Headless CMS samples here at Oracle. The first step we need to do is to clone the repository from GitHub. This code is publicly available for you to use, extend, or comment on. To do this, we copy the URL from the GitHub and open a command prompt. We then run git clone and specify the URL. We now need to open the project in an editor. For this sample, I will be using Visual Studio Code. The next step we need to do is install the dependent libraries that the application needs in order to run. This is done using npm install in a command prompt. Now we will take a look at three files that have important roles in the configuration of the application. The first is package.json, a standard configuration file for a Node application such as this sample. It defines scripts that are used to build and run the sample, as well as listing the dependencies that are needed for the application to run. For this tutorial, we'll be using the build and the serve scripts to create a production build of the sample and then display it. One dependency that is worth noting is the Gatsby Source OCE plugin. This is a custom plugin that was written by Oracle to connect the Oracle Content CMS to Gatsby. Its default behavior is to download all the assets that have been made available on a publishing or preview channel and place them in the Gatsby cache where they can be queried and filtered using GraphQL. In this application, it is downloading all the metadata of the images that defined on the channel and then the binary files referenced by that asset metadata. The next file we will look at is the .env or .env file. This is a small file with the URL of the server as well as the ID of the channel exposing the CMS assets is specified. If a proxy URL is needed to connect to the Oracle content server from the build machine, then it can also be specified here. In the case of this build, the proxy URL is not necessary. Finally, we will look at the Gatsby config.js file. This file is central to any Gatsby application. It is used to configure different aspects of the program, including the parameters needed to run the plugins. Looking at the settings of this, we can see that we are configuring the Gatsby source plugin. You will notice that the values set in the env file we just discussed are used here. The only mandatory fields are the content server, which must be set to the URL of the server, and the channel token, which specifies the channel that will be exposing the assets we wish to download. In this application, we are also using an optional feature called static asset download. With this, any actual binaries referenced by the download assets are not stored in the cache, but instead are downloaded into a local directory of the build. These binaries can then be referenced as local URLs in the application. The next step we will be taking is to build the application. This is done by running npm run build in the console. This will do the following. Trigger the Gatsby Source OCE plugin to download the asset metadata locally into the build cache. This would be the information about the images including their defined categories. It then downloads the individual images referenced in the metadata into a local directory. Next, it will call Gatsby Node.js to process the data and to figure out what pages need to be created based on the results. Finally, it creates the pages of the application, populating them with the appropriate data for the cache. To run the sample, we then execute npm run serve. This starts up a web server on port 9000 where we can view the application. Let's take a look at the result of the build. The home page shows summaries for each of the categories plus a few sample images belonging to that category. By clicking on any of these summaries, the user can go to a new page showing all the images in that category. Finally, by selecting any of the images on this page, you can get an enlarged view by clicking on it. The same view is available for all types. As a final part of the tutorial, we will look at the source code and discuss the role of each of the files within the application. The first file we will look at is Gatsby Node.js. This file is executed first once all the source plugins have run. Its role is to query the data in the build cache using GraphQL to determine what images are present and what categories the images belong to. Once that information has been determined, it will use that to determine which pages must be created. In this case, it is running a GraphQL query that is looking at all the OCE assets. All assets downloaded from a Oracle Content Server will be filed as OCE assets. This rather complicated filter is simply to exclude any assets that do not have a defined category from the dataset. In this case, it is looking for the name of the asset, the static URL, which is the URL that can be used to access the image used by the asset, and the category that the asset belongs to. Here, the result of the query is analyzed, and using a utility function defined in the services file down here, it will create a map of categories to lists of images. Once it has determined that, it will then create the home page, which is done using the index template JSX file, passing it the array of all the data. After that, it then iterates across all the categories and creates a separate page with all the details of each category. Let's now look at the template used to build the home page. This template is quite simple. All it does is it builds an array of gallery JSX objects. This is just an ordinary React component and displays the small grid that shows the elements in the category summary. The next and final file we will be looking at is the template that is used to create the category detail page. In other words, this is the page that shows all the images belonging to that category. So again, this is quite a simple page. All it is doing is retrieving the images and using that static URL from the query in Gatsby Node.js to display a grid of images, and then it uses a React modal as a base on which it builds the enlarged view of the images. One final point is that the CSS for each of these templates is in a special file that is keyed specifically to the source file. This allows us to have the CSS segregated to that particular template, and we do not have to worry about common CSS bleeding over onto other pages or affecting other layouts. That concludes the tutorial. I hope you found it interesting and informative. Thank you.